Hello, welcome to the Arterra Wines Vertical Tasting Experience. Today, owner and winemaker Jason Murray will lead you through 3 vintages of the Petit Verdot. Hope you enjoy. Cheers.
All right, welcome. We are doing our vertical tasting of 2015, 16, and 17 Petit Verdot. Petit Verdot, as a little bit of background, is a really good grape for Virginia. It's been one of our most consistent and reliable red grapes and wines to work with. It has a few positive features to it that give us this result. One is that it handles the winters quite well, better than most of our other red wine grapes. Second, even if it does have some frost damage in the spring, it still gives us an acceptable yield, so more reliability on the production side. Not a high cropper overall, but much more consistent than the other grapes. In terms of the way it ripens, it has some significant attributes also. There are smaller berries, so it's a higher proportion of skin to juice, so that favors concentration. But they're also loose clusters. They're nicely spread out berries, so the clusters dry very efficiently and rapidly. They don't stay wet, so we don't have the rot type of problems that can limit the hang time with this variety. And the vine inherently hits a point that comes relatively late in its ripening cycle, where it does shut down water uptake from the soil and movement into the grape clusters. So the berries do tend to dry out just a little bit before we pick. Not that you can visibly see it, but in terms of the weight of the fruit when we're picking. So if we normally pick into a 25-pound tote, by the time we're picking Petit Verdot, they might be 22 pounds or 20 pounds. They've definitely lost weight. That water that's lost is what's favoring concentration. So it's a softened berry, not necessarily a wilted berry. Very dark, great extraction to it. Its typical profile is that it's going to be a fuller bodied red, much bigger up front, and it mellows out as it finishes, but really smooth, really flavorful. We're seeing more and more of this in Virginia. A lot of wineries are doing really well with Petit. All right, so we're going to get started tasting the first of our 3 wines, and we have with us today a special guest, Stephanie and Ryan Barnett. So they're going to give us their comments and feedback. You can pretend you're them and sitting here at the table with me. All right, so first one that we have is the 2015 Petit Verdot. So this was a year that is best considered to be kind of an average year. It wasn't real notable in terms of hot, cold, wet, dry, anything really unique to it. So this is really kind of an interesting starting place because it can give us sort of a baseline factor, has the advantage of a couple years of age and development in the wine. And then I'm going to just give it a quick sample and give you feedback and comments on this. It has all the features that I love about Petit Verdot. Great flavor to it. Dark, smooth, fuller bodied, bigger volume, mellower finish to it. Just really pleasant overall. I just think it's a really nice example of what we can expect from Petit Verdot.
Yeah, what I really love about this one is when it hits the tongue, it just goes across the board, across the palate. But with that smooth, quick finish, it's so pleasant to experience. So this is a favorite.
Yeah. The mellow finish is amazing. Very, very good.
All right, so we are on to our second wine, 2016 Petit Verdot. This is a really interesting one because in some ways this was an ideal season for us. It was relatively dry through most of the summer, nice little bit of rain in August to help keep the vines going and on track, and then dried out through the rest of the ripening season. This was still, for us in terms of Petit Verdot, our overall vintage year, leaning towards the earlier side of harvesting because we were still recovering from a couple years worth of winter damage. So there was only so much ability to hang the limited amount of fruit we had so long. But that's where one of the big advantages of Petit Verdot comes in. This is a variety that near the end of its ripening cycle will shut down its growth, stop water movement into the berries, and the berries dry out just a little bit. This is one of the features that gives us really nice consistency from wet years, dry years, hot years, cool years in terms of Petit Verdot. One of the biggest differences that we are going to find in terms of this specific wine, 2016, this was the year that we started to use the insulated covers on the fermenters at the end of the fermentation to facilitate trapping more heat and greater extraction, especially of tannins and alcohol-soluble compounds that come at the end of the fermentation, and we pull a little bit more of that density and intensity into this wine, along with all that vivid flavor and volume that we get with Petit Verdot. We're all going to give it a quick sample. I've already described it, and we'll see if you guys have any feedback.
Well, I've got a question for you. When you said that the Petit Verdot was consistent, but you lose a little bit on yield, did I understand that correctly? Because of its consistency, you don't have a greater yield?
Some of what's happening is with Petit Verdot being a grape that shuts down growth and dries out a little bit, you are losing some volume, some juice volume, as that basically dissipates out of the grape as water. So it doesn't naturally set a high crop load in the first place, and then at the end of its ripening cycle when it starts to dry out, yes, you are losing some overall volume of juice that turns into wine as it's further concentrating itself. But that is one of the upsides of Petit Verdot, is this drying feature that happens consistently across years, is why this grape takes less of a swing from its wet years to dry years, hot years to cool years, is one of the reasons that I think it's a great grape for Virginia, because it produces its concentration, flavors, and quality consistently across years.
Do you have any plans on planting more Petit Verdot here at Arterra?
Well, that's a discussion always between Joaquin and I, because Joaquin spends a lot more hours out in the vineyard than I do. We both love it because its consistency allows it to overcome the obstacles of yield and quality, even though it's not a high-yielding grape. At the same time, as it grows as a vine in the vineyard, it has challenges that require extra effort to it. Most vines want to grow somewhat rigidly upright and work their way up through the trellis. Petit Verdot has a tendency to kind of act like a wet noodle, and it wants to just flop out to the sides all the time. And then it has a fragile characteristic to the canes where if you try and reposition it, it wants to just break off. So it requires persistent extra diligence to keep the canopy the way that we want it in order to ripen the fruit the way that we need it to. So we love it and will increase it if and as we need to as a reliable varietal. But at the same time, its challenges lead us to want to just keep it one component of what we're doing.
So, in evaluating the differences between these two, I'm trying to identify what I think is different, and I almost feel experientially that the 2016, the depth of the fruit on the palate is a little bit less than the 15. What are your thoughts on that?
I think you are making a really interesting and accurate assessment of, even though I am describing it as a more consistent year to year with Petit Verdot, the differences of the vintage years do come out and express. Some of that's the vintage year, some of that might be the cellar practices. But as a basic concept in Virginia, a hotter and drier year will be less fruit flavored and more bold intensity. A cooler and wetter year will be more fruit flavored and less bold intensity. So if we went from 15 being what I would consider to be an average or normal year, to 16 having more dry phases through the summer and then the fall, we could really look at that as favoring a little bit more intensity and a little bit less vivid fruit flavor characteristics coming through. At the same time, this is a balance feature that's coming out of the cellar practices. So if we instituted the insulated covers to trap more heat for extraction at the end of the fermentation phase, 2016 is going to bring in more of the tannic, grip, bolder, richer features, which are going to offset that bright, vivid, delicate fruit flavor characteristic. So It may be that the years are different. It may be that there is just a greater concentration of those bolder characteristics that are offsetting those brighter, fresher fruit characteristics.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so now we're going to introduce the 2017 vintage. In some ways, for me, this is a really exciting vintage because this starts to blend in the Arterra Estate Vineyard Petit Verdot with the Seven Oaks Vineyard site that's over in Philmont. Our yields in the estate vineyard were still low with the vines being young and Petit Verdot being a low cropper and us having weak soils, but it's a component that's introduced into this and continues as we move forward in future vintages. But also, I think 2017 was one of those years where things really just sort of came together. We had higher yields across the board, both in terms of recovery from the 14 and 15 winter damage, that by 17, we had higher yields at the Seven Oaks site, and we had red fruit cropping at the Arterra Estate Vineyard. That gives us the flexibility to tolerate a little bit more risk and potential of yield losses through the predation of birds, raccoons, whatever it's going to be. So we can ripen longer, look for those definitely advanced ripeness levels in the fruit. Otherwise, 17 was kind of an interesting year. It was a good year overall. It got kind of cool in August, which maybe would have thought that the ripeness levels weren't going to get where we wanted to go. But then we got really warm and some humidity in October, which was very unusual and posed its own problems for a lot of the fruit, but not so much for Petit Verdot. Petit Verdot tends to tolerate these conditions really well. We also started to bird net all of the fruit in 2017 so we could ripen longer. So I'm really excited about the ripeness levels that we achieved in the 2017 vintage in this Petit Verdot, which is the current vintage that we have available. And this is combining ideal ripeness in the fruit with these more extractive practices in the cellar with the insulation covers on the fermenters at the end of fermentation. So we not only get all the bold tannin, but we get that more evolved, fully ripened, complex fruit flavor characteristics come through in the wine. So we're all going to give it a quick sample and see what we may think.
Just beautiful.
Good point.
17's a good year.
17.
Seems like it all came together.
But one of the things I was noticing through this vertical flight is the 2017 obviously tastes or smells much more, I don't want to use the term fresh, but it has a little bit more oomph to it. Whereas when we go back to the 2015, the nose on it's very much kind of just, for me, it reminds me more of like a port. Kind of like that sugary, that molasses.
I think some of that's going to be evolution coming from age in the 2015, that you get complexity from polymerization during maturation, whereas the youthfulness of the 2017 is still going to give you all that like vivid characteristic, but has a great starting point with the heightened extraction and the fully ripened characteristics in it that as it evolves should develop some really interesting characteristics.
Can you explain a little bit more about what the extraction does? Because I'm not quite sure I fully understand, not the extraction, but the addition of the insulation towards the end of fermentation. How does that support that extraction?
There's conceptually two phases of extraction in fermentation. One of them is going to be water-soluble compounds, the other being alcohol-soluble compounds. So water-soluble compounds are going to be as the fermentation is just getting started. So this is going to be when we are keeping the fruit, the fermentation cool to let things start the native yeast without having any negative biology really catching a hold. And at that point, we're getting colors, fruit flavors coming out. It is at the end of the fermentation, the alcohol-soluble compounds, or the tannins, those like rich, denser, stronger red wine characteristics are being extracted. This is favored by not only the level of alcohol, but the temperature. So if you think of it like tea, if you put a tea bag in a cup of cold water, it's going to be very mild. Whereas if you put a tea bag in a cup of hot water, it's black tea will have that stronger, more tannic extraction to it.
Yep.
So if we can hold the fermentations as they cross their natural peak temperature and start to drop in temperature, if we can instead hold that peak temperature longer with the higher alcohol, we can accelerate extraction of the alcohol soluble compounds in the wine, give us more of that like density and intensity in the wine pulled out. Makes us think of it as a bolder